What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
I broke every rule they drilled into me about being the so-called good daughter, and I won. Are you ready for a shocking truth? On Christmas night, my own brother looked straight at me across the table, with everyone else watching, and said, almost casually, "Losers don't belong here." He smirked like it was some kind of joke. The rest of the family laughed awkwardly, and I felt the kind of heat in my chest that makes you want to either shout or walk out. Instead, I just nodded slowly, smiled like nothing happened, and said nothing at all. And while no one at that table knew it, in that exact moment I decided something that would change every single day of his life going forward, because the bills that allowed him to play the role of winner were all being paid quietly by me, and I was done. For years, I had carried responsibilities that he pretended did not exist. It started small, back when he was launching what he called a business and needed someone to temporarily cover the rent because his credit was a mess. I co-signed the lease, and when he fell behind those first 3 months, I stepped in because my parents begged me, saying it was just a short-term situation until his new contracts came through. Months turned into years, and somehow I was still attached to that lease. On top of that, when he wanted the cheapest car insurance rate possible, he slipped onto my multi-policy plan, claiming he would Venmo me every month, which of course he never did, and I just paid the balance rather than argue. Then came the family phone plan where he demanded the newest iPhone but conveniently forgot that those monthly installments weren't free. Add in the dental coverage, which I extended to him when his employer cut corners, plus the fact that I had even hosted his business site on my own account so that he could look professional in front of clients, and you can start to see the full picture. Every piece of his so-called independent lifestyle was sitting quietly on my shoulders. At that Christmas dinner, as everyone chatted about vacation plans and exchanged gifts, I realized something crystal clear. I had been subsidizing not only his lifestyle, but also his arrogance, and the moment he called me a loser, he gave me the perfect excuse to set down every single one of those weights. I didn't yell, I didn't argue, I didn't even tell him what I planned to do. I just made a choice. That night, after leaving my parents' house, I logged into the family phone account and scheduled his line for removal at the end of the billing cycle. No warning, no reminder, just a clean break. Then I pulled up the hosting account and set his business site and email to expire in 7 days unless payment came directly from him. Every step I took was completely above board, within policy rules, and traceable with receipts and screenshots, but it also marked the first time in years that I acted like I mattered in this family equation. The strangest part was how calm I felt while doing it. There was no anger anymore, no endless replay of his insult in my head. I just knew that if I did not draw the line right then, I would still be covering his life when I was 50. My parents would never stop asking, he would never stop expecting, and I would never stop resenting. So I typed one short message to our family group chat: I am stepping out of the role of sponsor. No discussion. And I left it at that. I did not expect a reply right away, and I didn't get one, which told me that no one fully processed what I meant. To them, the word sponsor probably sounded strange, but that was the truth. I had been his silent sponsor, not his sister. By midnight, his number was already queued for suspension, his site was already in countdown mode, and I was already breathing easier than I had in years. The next morning, while I poured myself coffee in complete silence, I realized the real fun had only just begun, because by breakfast he was already unreachable, and I was not the one panicking. By the time the holiday glitter had settled into the same tired corners of my parents' house and everyone posted their little carousels about family and gratitude, the decision I made in complete silence had started to show its teeth. Because when his line finally dropped off the family plan at the stroke of the billing cycle and the carrier pushed through the suspension notice that I had scheduled while rinsing cranberry sauce off my hands, the first thing to fail was not some sentimental thread between siblings, but the very mundane scaffolding that held up his daily performance of being in control, beginning with two-factor logins that went nowhere and calendar reminders that could not ping a phone that no longer existed on my account. which meant that the morning's team call came and went without him while he scrambled between borrowed devices and public Wi-Fi like a tourist trying to print a boarding pass at the wrong gate. I did not gloat, because this was never about humiliation in front of an audience. It was about ending the private tax I had been paying for years on someone else's image, yet I will admit there was a grim kind of relief in hearing, through the grapevine that is family text threads and shared friends with loose tongues, that he had tried to log into his business email and discovered the countdown banner I placed in the account center had already started ticking in quiet, impersonal language. That did not accuse or shame, but simply stated that payment from the registered owner was required by a certain date, and that the admin privileges previously held by me were now locked behind credentials he did not control. Because in the same way he had called me a loser as if the word had no cost, he had floated for years on access I provided as if access grew on trees. The social fallout began in the most predictable way. Tara sent me a message that tried to sound reasonable while carrying the old expectation that I would fix everything, because I always had, asking whether I could just reinstate the phone line until after the wedding and whether I might keep the email working while he sorted things out, and I answered with one sentence that I had rehearsed not out of cruelty, but to stop myself from slipping back into the same rut, telling her that I was no longer paying and that all accounts had been transferred to him where they belonged, which she did not like because it forced her to admit that the lifestyle she was counting on was underwritten by someone who was not invited into the picture. And when she pivoted to a softer guilt tack about family unity and not making a scene, I told her that nothing I had done created a scene, because scenes require noise, and I had used only settings and policies and dates. My parents tried their strategy too, a familiar mix of nostalgia and obligation where they dug up stories about childhood kindness and reminded me of times he had stood up for me in school, as if those moments, which I do not deny, could be traded like coupons for a lifetime of free utilities and insurance. So I printed a simple ledger that I had kept for my taxes, not as ammunition, but as proof that I was not inventing the size of this burden. And I handed it to them without commentary, a neat list of lines and dates and policies that, when laid out in black and white, turned the room quiet in a way no speech could, because even people who prefer stories to spreadsheets understand a total when it glares from the bottom of a page. When the car insurance renewal rolled around, I ended the subsidy there as well, which the insurer processed with the kind of mechanical indifference that I have learned to love in systems that do not care about family politics. And a notice went to him explaining that he would need to open his own plan, and that the price would reflect his actual record rather than the discount my bundle had provided. And he called me from a number I did not recognize to say this was petty and vindictive and beneath me, which might have stung once, but now landed as static, because all I had done was move costs to the person who had incurred them, and when he asked if we could handle it like adults, I told him that adults pay their bills, and that I would be happy to email him a list of vendors he could contact directly, which I did, along with the dates when various services would lapse if he chose not to act. He tried the last tactic that always used to work, pivoting the narrative toward my supposed coldness and suggesting that I was overreacting to a single joke made at a holiday table, and I let him talk until he ran out of phrases, after which I said, in a voice that surprised even me with its calmness, that the joke did not create the boundary, it merely revealed it, because the day he said losers do not belong here, he declared a value system in which I was not a person but a utility, and utilities send bills, they do not attend family dinners hoping for better treatment next time. The domain banner kept counting, the email kept failing, the missed team call turned into a curious message from a colleague who asked me, not unkindly, whether there was some outage he should know about since my name had been on a few of the original setup forms. And I replied with a single clear paragraph explaining that the account holder was responsible and that I no longer administered anything on his behalf, which took all of 60 seconds and required none of the emotional labor that used to leave me drained for days. And while I was drafting that reply, my phone lit up with an unfamiliar office number, and a measured voice introduced himself as Mr. Collins, my brother's supervisor. who wanted to confirm one detail about the website and the email, and whether the payment really needed to come from the account holder, and I told him yes, it did, and that I could not help beyond pointing him to the correct channel. And he thanked me with the kind of courtesy people use when they have just realized who in the room actually keeps the train on the tracks. I hung up, looked at the quiet apartment around me, and felt the smallest click of something locking into place, not triumph exactly, but the recognition that a line once drawn does not need to be redrawn every day. And as my phone vibrated again with a cascade of messages from family and friends, and one last pleading text from Tara asking me to reverse everything before it damages his standing at work, I put the device face down on the counter and let the notifications go wild, because the first person to call me was not my brother, it was his boss, and that told me the next move would not be a plea or a tantrum, it would be paperwork. When Mr. Collins' voice faded and the line clicked dead in that efficient corporate way that always sounds like a door closing softly but firmly, I stood there with the hum of the refrigerator and the light on the counter and realized that for the first time in a very long stretch of years, the next action in this story did not depend on whether I felt brave or guilty. It depended only on whether I was willing to put my choices in writing, because while families can argue endlessly about who owes what to whom and why, paper does not argue. Paper just sits there with dates and terms and signatures, and if you have the stomach to let it speak, it will do the work that raised voices never do. So I opened the drawer where I keep the folder that I used to call my tax sanity pack, a private archive of the little rescues that add up to a second household, and I spread out the documents the way a mechanic lays out tools before touching an engine. Starting with the lease that I co-signed back when his credit could not hold a deposit without wobbling, moving to the insurance policy declarations that folded him into my bundle at a discount he did not earn, and landing on the little promissory note we drafted at the dining table during his so-called launch phase, a tidy paragraph that said I had covered those early months of rent and that he would repay me by a certain season with modest interest. A document he signed with an easy flourish because he believed, or at least acted like he believed, that these formalities were a show we put on to make me feel safe, not a promise that would ever be collected. I do not enjoy bureaucracy, but I respect it because it does not require charm or hierarchy, only follow-through. So I wrote a courteous letter to the property manager informing them that at renewal I would not continue as co-signer and that all communication regarding that change should go to Evan as the primary tenant. And I attached a copy of the clause that allows a co-signer to step off at term end when notice is given in writing, and I sent it certified because I am done playing the game where people claim they never saw an email. Then I sat with the promissory note and composed an equally courteous message to my brother laying out the total, not padded, not vindictive, just the exact amount we had agreed he would return. And I told him that if he wished, we could formalize a payment plan through the small claims court so that records would exist beyond the reach of anyone's mood, which was my way of saying that this is not a fight, it is a ledger finally being balanced. Predictably, the family chorus rose before the mail had even moved, with my mother calling to say that family does not do paperwork, and my father asking whether I could at least delay the cosigner removal until he finds his footing. And when I answered that family should not require paperwork, but since it did, this was the language we would use, there was a pause heavy enough to count as weather, after which came the old insistence that I was embarrassing them, that I was making a private matter public, and I said that nothing becomes public by filing a form unless the people involved insist on talking about it at dinner, which I would not. And if they wanted silence so badly they could have had it years ago by not asking me to carry everything behind the scenes. Tara entered the conversation sideways with a message that began with diplomacy and ended with a block, asking whether I could at least remove the domain banner because it was causing confusion with a vendor and hinting that my timing felt strategic, which made me laugh a little even though I did not send that reaction, because yes, the timing was strategic, the strategy being that I was finished pretending his life ran on his competence when it actually ran on my logins, so I wrote back one sentence that said the account holder could resolve the issue by paying the invoice and that I no longer controlled the service, and then I let her do whatever she needed to do with that information, including deciding that I was the villain. which is a part one can survive if it means I stop being the valet. In the group chat that never sleeps, Evan announced that I was taking him to court, which made it sound like a spectacle rather than a filing, and I answered with a dry post that listed, in plain language and without emotion, that a note existed, that it had come due, and that formalizing a plan was the fairest way to protect both sides from further misunderstandings, and then I muted the thread because there is nothing left to gain from live commentary. There is only the quiet progression of envelopes and timestamps, and while they ranted about loyalty and optics, I printed the small claims form, filled it out carefully, and walked it to the clerk who looked at my paperwork and stamped a number that, to me, felt less like a weapon and more like the clean edge between before and after. Meanwhile, Mr. Collins sent a brief, professionally generous email asking for clarity about who owned what in the digital mess and whether he could expect service to stabilize if his employee did the necessary administrative work. And I replied with exactly what he needed to know and nothing more, confirming that the domain and the site belonged to the account listed under Evan's name and that any access my credentials once provided had been revoked and would not be reinstated. And he thanked me with a sentence that carried no warmth and no hostility, only relief that someone had finally drawn a straight line through a problem that had been presented to him as a fog. By the end of that week, the carrier had closed his line on my plan, the insurer had separated our policies, the landlord had logged my notice, and the court had a case that would not require drama to resolve. Only payments to be made on the schedule we would agree to, and when my mother called again to ask me to be kind, to show mercy, to remember that we are blood, I said I was being kind in the only way that works with a man who confuses support with fuel for his performance, and that if anyone wanted to accuse me of cruelty for asking an adult to pay for his own phone, his own insurance, his own website, and his own rent, they were free to do so as long as they also agreed to take my place on the accounts by the end of the day, which, of course, no one did. I slept better that night than I had in years, not because I had hurt him, not because I had won some public round, but because a promise written in the language of money had finally been allowed to exist in the world without apology, and as I drifted off, my phone buzzed once more with a new number that left a voicemail without a hello, a long exhale and a pause, and then a careful question in his voice, the kind that sounds like a person trying to find a door in the dark, asking not for an apology or a truce, but for a tally, for an amount, for the first step towards square, and I lay there in the quiet thinking that paper had finally done what pleading never could, while knowing the next move would carry my signature too. Because the thing about drawing a boundary is that you have to keep standing there when they finally test the fence. The call from my brother where he asked, almost sheepishly, what he owed me, did not feel like the end of anything but rather the beginning of a new stage in which every carefully hidden dependency would have to come out into the open. Because when someone has built their image on confidence and charm, the discovery that those qualities do not keep phones connected, insurance active, or leases renewed is not just a financial inconvenience, but a reputational collapse, and reputation is the currency he valued more than dollars, more than family, more than truth. The first real crack showed at his office, not through gossip or rumor, but through the simplest kind of failure, because his email, the one he used for proposals and client confirmations, began to fail sender authentication checks, which meant that the polished messages he fired off late at night to impress potential partners landed straight in spam folders, and while he blamed technical issues and system glitches, the truth was far less mysterious. The account had reached the point where payment was required, and I had stepped out, leaving him alone with invoices he had ignored for so long that the system itself was now louder than his excuses. His supervisor, Mr. Collins, had already spoken to me with a voice that carried no affection, but also no hostility, only the tired patience of someone who has seen the difference between reliability and theater too many times. And when he asked again whether service would stabilize, I told him in the same even tone that it was up to the account holder, which was my brother, and that I had no involvement anymore. That was the exact moment his professional brand began to fray, not because I had slandered him or spoken ill, but because systems that do not bend to charm had exposed how much of his stability had been borrowed. At home, My parents tried a strategy they thought would work. They invited me to a dinner under the banner of clearing the air, which in our family always meant that they wanted me to listen quietly while they patched over his behavior and convinced me to resume my role without openly admitting it. But I came prepared with a folder that contained the carrier termination notice, the insurer's separation documents, the lease renewal clause, and a copy of the promissory note. I did not read speeches. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult him across the table. I simply placed the documents where everyone could see them and said that these were not threats, they were not punishments. They were the facts of accounts that had existed for years and that had been kept alive by me until Christmas night, after which I had chosen to stop. The room went quiet in a way that only paper can enforce, and for once my brother had no comeback that could generate laughter or sympathy, because dates and policies are not swayed by smirks. He tried, of course, to claw back some sense of control by pulling me aside after dinner and suggesting that if I could keep everything quiet for just a few more weeks, he would manage the transition and no one at work would need to know. As if I had been the one broadcasting the reality instead of holding it in silence for years, and I told him plainly that I had already kept quiet far longer than anyone could have expected, and that the silence had ended when I drew the boundary, not when. He decided he was finally ready to face it. I think it shook him to hear me say that, because he was so used to me stepping back whenever he asked for time, covering the gaps until he caught up, except he never really caught up. He just leaned harder. The social consequences spread quickly, because weddings do not plan themselves and deposits do not pay themselves, and Tara's family, who had always looked at him as a man with potential and polish, suddenly started asking why payments were delayed, why his phone was unreliable, why emails were bouncing, and he had no easy story to tell them that did not involve admitting that for years he had been living on a scaffold someone else built. My mother called me in tears, claiming that I was ruining his future, and I told her something that even I did not expect to say out loud. I was not ruining his future. I was handing it back to him. Because carrying a man's adulthood on your back is not love, it is theft of his chance to grow up, and if she could not see that, then maybe she was as invested in the illusion as he was. When Mr. Collins asked me to provide a professional letter clarifying who owned what, I agreed, not to undermine my brother, but to finally untangle myself completely, so I wrote a short, factual document that stated the domain, the email, and the related accounts were registered under Evan's name, and that I held no ownership and no responsibility for their upkeep, and when I signed my name at the bottom, it felt like the final cut of a rope that had been burning my hands for years. There was no anger in that letter, no bitterness, just clarity, and clarity is the one thing he had avoided at all costs, because it stripped away the performance. In the days that followed, the silence between us grew heavier, not because I refused to pick up but because he stopped calling altogether, until one evening a borrowed number appeared on my phone and I heard his voice, stripped of charm, asking me in a tone that almost sounded like a stranger's, "What do I owe you?" It was not the question of a man ready to pay back every cent, and I knew that, but it was the question of someone finally realizing that the scaffolding was gone and that his future depended not on performance, but on whether he could stand without it. I hung up that call and sat in my kitchen thinking about the years I had spent smoothing over every mess, the nights I stayed up making sure automatic payments cleared, the mornings I covered late fees with my own account so he would not notice, and I felt a strange calmness, because while nothing had been settled yet, the direction was finally set. He had admitted, if only by asking that question, that he owed me something, and once you reach that point, there is no return to the illusion that he built everything himself. And yet, even as I felt that satisfaction, I knew the story was not finished, because words are not payments and intentions are not actions, and until he showed me that he could step into adulthood not with promises, but with proof, all of this was just the prelude. Which is why, when he asked that question, I did not give him the number immediately. I told him I would calculate it and send it in writing, and then I ended the call, because the reckoning that was coming next was not about emotional apologies. It was about documented responsibility, and I was ready to put that on paper too. When I finally sat down to calculate the exact number my brother had asked about, I did not approach it with anger or vindictiveness, but with the same cold precision that I had learned to use whenever money and family collided. Because emotions are endless and slippery, but numbers, when written clearly, carry their own authority, and in this case, they told a story that no one could laugh off at a holiday table. I went through the promissory note we had signed years earlier, adjusted for the modest interest we had agreed upon, subtracted the few reimbursements he had actually made, and tallied the payments I had documented for rent, insurance, the phone plan, and the domain hosting. I resisted the temptation to inflate or pad the total because I did not want this to feel like revenge dressed up as arithmetic. I wanted it to be exact, undeniable, and final. When I looked at the final sum, it was not astronomical, but it was significant enough to sting, the kind of number that makes you realize that what you brushed off as just this once or temporary had been carried by someone else for years. I drafted a letter, not long but thorough, outlining the total balance and presenting him with two choices. He could agree to a structured settlement plan and begin making payments within the month, or I would let the small claims process continue until judgment, which would follow him publicly and formally. I was careful not to lace the letter with sarcasm or with the cutting remarks that had been sitting in my throat for years, because I had already learned that silence and facts hurt far more than any insult could, and I wanted him to feel the full weight of numbers that could no longer be shifted onto my shoulders. When he received the letter, he called me with the same blend of charm and pleading that had worked so many times in the past, suggesting that I reduce the total, arguing that family should not charge family, and promising that if I forgave part of it, he would take care of the rest quickly. I listened to every word and then told him, in a tone that felt as natural as breathing, that the amount I had sent him was already reduced, that I had excluded certain costs the court might not consider, and that if anything, he should be grateful I had not demanded every last cent. For the first time in years, he had no quick reply, no joke, no deflection, and the silence on the line told me more than words ever could. He understood that the ground had shifted permanently. The weeks that followed were filled with small, but telling moments that showed me the scaffolding was collapsing. He submitted documents to the phone carrier to open his own plan, paying deposits he had never imagined, and he forwarded me proof of insurance for his car at a premium that must have made him wince, but that was now his responsibility alone. The landlord sent me a copy of the lease renewal, this time with his name and only his name attached, releasing me officially from the shadow of his obligations. And when the first installment of the promissory note arrived in my account, not as cash slipped under the table but as a formal transfer labeled with his name, I felt a kind of satisfaction that was deeper than triumph. It was closure. My parents reacted as I expected, alternating between praising him for finally stepping up and scolding me for being harsh enough to force him into adulthood through paperwork rather than love, and I told them that if love had worked, I would never have had to send certified letters or file court claims, and that what they called harshness was in fact the only language he had ever respected. They did not like hearing it, but they could not argue with the results, because for once their son was paying his own way, and it was not because of a lecture, a second chance, or a promise. It was because there was no other option left. In the end, I did exactly what I told him I would. Once the first installment cleared and the lease release was confirmed, I dismissed the small claims case with prejudice, meaning it could not be brought again, and I sent him one final message that said, "We are square. Do not contact me unless it concerns our parents' health." There was no flourish, no parting insult, no attempt to claim moral victory. The victory was already written into the structure of his new life, one where his bills and his reputation rose or fell on his own actions. Weeks passed without a word, until one evening my phone lit up with a new number and a text that read, "I get it now." There was no explanation attached, no demand, no promise. Just those 4 words, and I stared at them for a long time before setting the phone down without replying. It was not cruelty that stopped me from answering, it was recognition that nothing I said would matter more than the silence I had already built. He had finally realized, perhaps for the first time, that his words had no power over me anymore, and that the only currency that counted was responsibility. As I sat there in the quiet, I thought about how this all began, with a careless insult at a Christmas table that was meant to make me smaller, but instead gave me the push I needed to step out of a role I should never have accepted in the first place. My revenge had not been about destroying him or humiliating him. It had been about cutting the cord that allowed him to live on my credit, my patience, and my silence. And in the end, the most satisfying part was not that he paid me back, or that his coworkers and fiancé saw the cracks, but that I no longer carried the weight. I was free. And maybe the best revenge, the one that no one claps for at family dinners, but that echoes in the quiet of your own life, is simply walking away with the knowledge that you never have to play sponsor again, because you finally proved to him, to your parents, and most importantly to yourself, that you were never the loser in that story. You were the one who held it all together, and once you stopped, everything fell exactly where it belonged.